Firstly, what do you hope India's role will be in terms of its involvement in the recovery of this global financial crisis? And secondly, what do you think India wants its role to be?
But I think it's quite clear that, look, as somebody said when the G20 meeting took place in Washington, the Chinese and the Saudis had money, and the Chinese said, look, maybe they'll put some money on the table. The Indians were very good in giving advice, and they were not putting any money on the table. So if the expectation is that, look, the others would now come in and put money to make it easier for the West to make the transition, India is not in a position of China or the Middle East to be able to put in those resources. The second, in terms of that, the expectation that India, along with China, would stimulate its economy, that demand is going to drag the rest of the world into moving faster. I mean, those are the basic expectations from outside. India has slowed down, but India will continue to grow. But whether the Indian growth is big enough to kind of give a boost to the US economy, that's not very clear at this stage. But my sense is, I think at this point everyone is doing just pray, throw something at these problems, hoping like hell it'll work. Like Obama himself says, look, it's a trial and error. Mostly it'll be probably error, that we'll keep trying this. But I don't see a dramatic role for India. I don't think India sees that role itself in any such fundamental way. The trick, I think, at this point for people like India and China is who will be left standing in a reasonable position when things turn around. If you're standing up reasonably well, I think you are a king in 3 years' time.
Let me add one point on that. I think what the crisis illustrates is that India is not as integrated into the global economy as China is. And that's reflected in the trade statistics, where China is already the third and approaching the second largest trading country in the world. That's right. And in terms of reserves, it has the largest reserves in the world, whereas India is at a much lower level. In terms of what India wants, at the risk of being corrected by Raja, I would say India does not see itself as a key to this crisis, but it doesn't want to be ignored. If you tried to have a group of 19 without India, we would have a major problem with India. But India is not pushing to join the group of 7. So, in other words, India wants to be involved as one of the BRIC countries, the Brazil, China, India, Russia grouping, but it doesn't see itself as a driver in this particular area.
I'd like to give a non-Indian, non-American point of view. I've just returned from India, where I co-chaired the India-Singapore Strategic Dialogue, which went very well. I want to just make, but now I'll follow my wife's rule, 3 points. One, something that is not in the public domain, and yet it's important, and in a way it contradicts the view of Mr. Roach. According to the World Bank, at the moment, 70% of world growth is coming from Asia. I think that's a significant contribution that Asia is making to the revival of the world economy. Point number 2, for the reasons Steve said, because India is much less dependent on export-led growth than China or the ASEAN countries. When we were in India last week, the Indian economists, the private sector leaders, and government officials were of the same view that in spite of the global downturn, India will be able to achieve its growth rate of 7+% this year. And I think that if India can grow at that healthy rate, it is a contribution to the world economy. Just as the Chinese leaders keep saying that if we conduct our affairs well, it is a contribution to the world. I agree with that. But my third point is that we in ASEAN warmly welcomes India's re-engagement with the region. And I say re-engagement because historically, the Indian civilization greatly influenced the countries and peoples of Southeast Asia. And it is only since the early 1990s, with the Look East policy of Narasimha Rao, that India had decided to re-engage itself with this region, and we warmly welcome that. As you know, India has FTA with Singapore, and it has completed its negotiation of an India-ASEAN FTA. And I'm hoping that in Hua Hin at the end of this month, that India and ASEAN will sign that FTA. I think that that would be a very good thing to do. So we welcome India, and for this reason, the ASEAN family worked very hard to persuade others to include India in the East Asia Summit process.
I have actually two very different questions. The first one is to tag on to Professor Koh's reading of Senator Clinton's speech with regards like India and China, logically, because of their economic and security significance, would take greater prevalence. So my question is with regards to ASEAN itself. Should ASEAN be worried in the longer term of its relevance to the United States? And if so, what more should ASEAN be doing? The second question is on Afghanistan. This is more of a personal interest question. Does the United States actually know what its ideal end state should be? And if it does, how much will it cost and how long will it take?
I do think the United States knows what it wants to achieve. It wants to prevent the return of the Taliban, and it wants to make sure that Afghanistan is not a location that sponsors or provides a platform for international terrorism. To achieve this, it would like to achieve a stable government in Afghanistan, which suggests that we haven't really read our history books very carefully. The question of whether we can do it is a separate question. But I do think that we have an idea of what we would like to achieve in Afghanistan. The instability in Pakistan adds enormously to the complexity of a problem that is enormously complex in its own right. And I think that's the challenge that Dick Holbrooke is going to face. If anybody can produce a solution there, it's Dick Holbrooke. But even Dick, with all of his ability to beat the Balkans into shape, may not be able to deal with the challenge of Afghanistan and Pakistan. But I think we have to wait and see on that. Should ASEAN be worried? The answer is no. I think probably at the moment, ASEAN should have more confidence that the United States will be paying more attention to it than ever before, partly because the President of the United States has a direct personal link to Indonesia, which is a very important part of ASEAN. Does that mean that we will necessarily give ASEAN as much attention as it wants? Not if ASEAN follows Ambassador Koh's prescription that it shouldn't dream that it can compete with India and China for attention, but I think it's possible that ASEAN will want more attention than it gets.
I think you can already see the President Obama redefining the American objectives in Afghanistan. During the campaign, he said, look, Iraq was the wrong war, Afghanistan was the right war. Bush took his eyes off the right war and went into the wrong war. So now the focus must be on Afghanistan. Therefore, there are going to be more resources. Both intellectual, diplomatic, and military resources are going to be devoted to Afghanistan. There's no doubt about it. But clearly, the what is victory is being redefined. If you noticed, Mr. Gates, Secretary of Defense, to the Congress, he said, look, the objective is not to create a Valhalla, as they say, in Afghanistan, a heaven, a paradise, or a Jeffersonian democracy, or even a centralized state. So I think the thing is, I think there is a pragmatism in the new administration that you got to take a more regional approach. You got to limit your objectives to a more modest level in Afghanistan, not in the way of creating a democracy or of a structure somewhat like a European state. So I think there is pragmatism, but the challenge, as Ambassador Roy said, is pretty tough. But my sense is they cannot leave in a hurry, because even if you leave them, they're not going to leave you. So the problem is not just Afghanistan. The problem is If we told the Taliban that, look, you want to do what you want to do to your women, you do what you want, look, as long as you don't trouble me, I have no problem with you. That deal was attempted twice over with the Taliban in the wake of the East Africa bombings in 98 and then after September 11th. Both times Americans went to the Taliban and said, look, we have no quarrel with you. You hand over the Mr. Bin Laden, that we are fine with you. We'll help you in whatever way you want. But Taliban was not willing to make that deal. The problem today is even if the US withdraws from Afghanistan, the problem is if Al-Qaeda and Taliban consolidate, create a new territory from which to launch global attacks, that threat remains. So in a sense, the Americans are tied into Afghanistan irrespective. The question is, so how do you define that strategy? How do you create a new framework that would make victory more possible than the kind of strategy they pursued in the last 8 years?